So I'm Ayush. I'm a PhD student at the Media Lab in the group called Camera Culture, and we try to build AI systems that can help achieve some kind of large-scale population orchestration. And we use these tools around the world, working with governments, enterprises, nonprofits, and places to help them design more optimal policies for large ecosystems in the context of health, energy, supply chains, and any problem that involves a combination of changing environments and adaptive behaviors of people and can impact millions. So this is roughly a question you care about. So I'll start with something simple. So the primary question my team cares about is what can we and how can we learn from a billion agents? Okay, sorry. Yeah. So this is a picture I clicked at Whole Foods a couple weeks back. And you're paying $11 for eggs. That's pretty expensive. So why do you think this is happening? Just a guess.
You're buying pasture raised instead of the cheap
No, these ones used to be $7.
Whole food, that's.
Yeah, so yes, these used to be Whole Food cheap was $8, and just since the beginning of January, egg prices are 100% up in the country.
It's a conspiracy.
Yeah, that could be a good point to start. Yeah. So just so it turns out this price rise is from something far more interesting and complex than inflation. What's happening is should probably blame migration patterns of birds across the US and not necessarily inflation. So okay, so before I just a guesstimate, how many birds are in the we had that discussion a few days ago.
I'm not answering.
Okay. So how many birds are on planet Earth? Just an order of magnitude can. Take
60 billion. Million. Yeah. 100 billion.
109.
Medium?
Yeah, so there are almost 100 billion birds that have been recorded on planet, and surprisingly, we do a really good census of birds than we do for humans. So if you're interested in a bird census, there's this website called eBird. Ideally, there should be eHuman to do a human census, but we don't have it yet. But there's this website called eBird, which does a really rigorous census of almost 100 billion birds across the entire planet at a weekly resolution. So they tell you for all 52 weeks of the year, which bird will be found where at almost a 5 kilometer by 5 kilometer radius. So they have a pretty good sense of birds. But there are 100 billion birds on Earth. And every year, around 5 billion birds migrate across the US skies. And they sort of go north during the summers, come south during the winters. And this year, they're carrying something called the H5N1 virus. And basically what's happening is these birds, infected birds, migrate across the skies. They land on farms where they interact with chickens and cows. The infected birds infect chickens and the chickens die. Cows get sick. From the sick cows, infected milk moves through the dairy supply chain, affecting our grocery supplies. And it also sort of moves through the agri workers to infect humans. And now it started to mutate to infect humans to human infections. And just in context of the last couple of years, we've had to kill almost 100 million chicken. We've cost the dairy industry almost $4 billion annualized. And now there are human to human infections. And H5N1 is very quickly moving to become a moderate to high risk pandemic potential. The US government just bought 5 million vaccine doses. Europe just started vaccinating, and there are severe human cases starting to come out.
So was this a mutation of the previous Asian bird flu of a few years ago?
Yes, it's a mutation.
Yeah.
So the reason why this year is tricky is because just in this year, the bird flu has mutated to infect to sort of transmit between mammals, from mammals to humans, from birds to humans, from cattle to human. And the only left mutation is human to human.
Yeah.
The day that happens, things will get bad really quickly. I mean, it's not as transmissible as the one from 20 years ago, but the historical avian bird flu has a 50% mortality rate. So if it mutates to be human to human, it will probably not be as transmissible, but still it can be really deadly because it hits you both in terms of human health and food supply.
Is there a vaccine?
There is a vaccine, and the US government has been stockpiling vaccines.
Yeah.
Finland just started vaccinating last week. Ideally, you should start vaccinating before a virus spreads,
Yeah.
but in the US, we tend to like wait for after it is often not a great idea.
Think about where we're going from here.
Yeah, in a sense. So like this is like one of the many ways you're already experiencing the bird flu is like expensive eggs and milk. But yeah, we hope like that's where it stays. But like this isn't just about birds. You see, like every year, like billions of interactions shape the world. When you like cross paths with people on public transport, you execute digital transactions, you like sit in classrooms like these to like study, or you have like packages delivered to your doorstep. And like because of this hyper connected world that we live in, singular disruptions can turn into like global crises very quickly. For instance, like COVID cost us almost $3.5 trillion. Like a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal that costs us $10 billion. And like, I don't know if you followed CrowdStrike, which cost like multi-billion dollars because of like a bad software update. And like hurricane usually cause like a few $1 billion in infrastructure loss, independent of all human effort. So what we really care about is, can we come up with ways to stop these disruptions before they become a global crisis? And imagine if you had like some kind of a God's eye view to society. What would you do? You could come up with ways in context of the bird flu, figure out ways to like capture how like billions of birds migrate across the US skies, how do they land on farms, and how does disease transmit from the birds to the livestock to the humans throughout like the dairy industry. And then you would analyze how incentives of farmers to report infected livestock or the disruptions in supply chain, preferences of consumers sort of ripple out across the entire ecosystem. And then you could come up with policies to stop the spread of the disease or like somehow regulate or control prices. But this is a hard problem for AI to solve because most AI systems that we have today are not very good at capturing this complex webs of interconnections, looking at like extremely like continuous time migration patterns of birds, very discrete time disease transmission on farms, and like very like complex disease transmission through like many species. And our AI systems are not very good at capturing extremely heterogeneous behaviors because incentives of farmers can significantly affect how fast we start tracking a disease. Or, for example, what's happened in the H5N1 bird flu is because poultry dies, the poultry farmers have been very inclined to report infections and deaths because it's an absolute loss of revenue for them because the chickens are dead. Like they won't give any more eggs. But in the case of the dairy industry, farmers have been very hesitant to report because the cattle get sick, but you can still milk an infected cattle, and pasteurization kills the virus. It just falls, like just their production supply falls, and the US government hasn't been giving enough incentives for farmers to like make it economically worthwhile. And that is the reason why the virus has had a lot more time to mutate and become dangerous. So to stop the problem both from a health and economic standpoint, tracking the very diverse incentives of heterogeneous behaviors across the entire ecosystem are pretty important to track. And when you don't have good AI systems that can make extremely multi-scale decisions, like the kind of questions we care about is if the CDC has got $1 million and they want to test for the virus, should they invest more money in incentivizing farmers to report? Should they go and do more bulk testing at the pasteurization centers? Or should they come up with ways to like test? Or should they ask private companies like Whole Foods, Target to test infected stuff at the source of delivery? And like when you're making these decisions, you want to like optimize across multiple scales. You want to capture extremely heterogeneous behaviors that ripple out and influence each other across like very complex interaction webs. And this is a hard problem.
Does Lloyd's and other major insurance companies write policies, or is this an act of God? And if you kill 1 billion chickens, it's not covered in insurance?
Is it? I'm not aware of that.
Okay, because that would be incentive. To be more honest, if you think you're gonna be compensated for those losses, that might provide some incentive.
Yeah, could be.
More fair.
I mean, after COVID, we have seen like a lot of pandemic insurance products being like sold to countries, which is again like usually not on great terms.
Yeah.
Like a lot of Europe, like a lot of African countries are like sort of putting like their energy grids on collateral to protect against a future pandemic, which is like not very sustainable for national security. So like, very complex, non-obvious outcomes can play out. And this is a hard problem because like most of AI systems are not designed for this. Because to solve this problem, we need like a new perspective to AI. We need sort of like a new set of AI systems that don't just care about capturing smart behaviors of individuals, but can capture, in a sense, like how billions of interactions ripple out and influence and shape collective outcomes. And this is sort of what we invent at the Media Lab, is this new paradigm of large population models, which can not only capture extremely heterogeneous behaviors of millions of agents, but also observe how interactions ripple out and shape collective outcomes. And we've built like platforms that allow us to simulate billions of interacting entities, simultaneously capturing adaptiveness in behaviors and stochastic interaction dynamics. And in the context of the H5N1 flu, we're sort of helping the CDC right now to track the bird flu from essentially fowl to fork, tracking like continuous time migration patterns of birds, extremely stochastic models of disease transmission across livestock farms, and a combination of species, to observe how this disease is spreading across the dairy supply chain, the agri industry, to track, to come up with policies to like stop the spread, help the industry regulate prices. To do this, we've had to solve like fundamental problems in AI, which large population models build on top of, where you can simulate extremely multi-scale and complex systems, like how you model migration of birds is very different from how you might model behaviors of individuals to how you might model like disease transmission on livestock farms. So you want to model extremely multi-scale and stochastic dynamics, and your systems are driven by very multimodal data. Like wastewater signal is usually a good indicator of, it's a good leading indicator of when an infection might have spread. For instance, like the Public Health Authority of Hawaii tomorrow is doing a press conference because farmers there seem to not be reporting cases, but wastewater signals are super high, which means that either like something weird is definitely going on. So they're trying to host like a press conference and get like the federal government to incentivize farmers to report. So you have extremely multimodal data at multiple levels of complexity, like wastewater signal, genomics coming from farms, case statistics coming from different parts of place, just migration data coming from like eBird. And you want to come up mechanisms where you can capture extremely multimodal data along with like adaptive behavioral models to integrate and assimilate all of this data, conduct analyses, and then can you come up with policies where you can design multiple objectives, and can you also do real-time response? Like before the problem becomes worse, how do you like do real-time response? Like, and you have all concerns around like privacy, decentralization, because most of these problems usually involve working with like extremely sensitive individual data. For instance, like vaccination status or disease status or something people might not be comfortable sharing. So how do you come up with paradigms where you can provide these like global orchestration views of a system? And essentially you want to have like a God's eye view, but you want it to be completely secure. You want it to be fully decentralized. So that can you like analyze collective outcomes without infringing on the privacy of any individual. And that's
Can I,
yeah, please.
Keisha, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Definitely. I'll go on camera as well too. This is incredibly fascinating to me, and such an amazing use of technology. But once I got over my fear, I started thinking about some things. And my question, and I don't necessarily have the answer to this, but how do we start creating a safe space to enable, because you mentioned several times, right? The farmers are not incentivized to report, you know, and that probably trickles down the ecosystem, right? As we each go about these projects where we're trying to create or make the world a better place, how do we create safe spaces to enable players to report or to come forward so that we can try to make the changes that are needed to be made in a way that protects the public? Because like I'm freaking out, literally.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And like in practice, we found like some of like turns out like even like building simulations is actually a good place to start, because it helps you like sort of account for what plausible incentives or constraints someone might have. I'll give you an example. So we work with the government of New Zealand, and one of the challenges that's happened after COVID is that during COVID, like we had to do like a lot of trade-offs around like how we give vaccines to people and there has like some kind of vaccine hesitancy just built into behaviors of people. And now the way it's trickling out further into society is that COVID vaccines were like experimental to some sense, and they were like meant to be like non-sterilizing. They won't stop you from getting infected. But now people have this hesitancy against vaccine, and that's trickling out to other vaccine programs. Like people don't want to give their children measles vaccines now, which have been like stabilized for 40 years.
Right.
So like, for example, like now their government is trying to figure out like how do we incentivize people in New Zealand to immunize their children against measles vaccines. Now that's a hard problem because New Zealand is where like people from a lot of the Pacific Islands migrate into. So they want to like come up with programs where they can incentivize people to take these vaccines, but they can't really like knock on doors or force people because did not work the last time. It's definitely not going to work this time. So again, like when you're trying to solve these kinds of problems, like these are tough conversations to have with the communities. I think you have some thoughts.
I was gonna say, fitting it into your framework, there are actually a lot of ways to act in that context and capture data on your action and analyze it. And in that context, actually paying people their Uber ride to go and get vaccinated, literally paying people money. There were a lot of actual measures that they took in the US, certainly during COVID, that had a very studied and demonstrable efficacy. I was working in this area. at the
Oh,
time.
nice. So that's really cool.
And so you are actually able to quite accurately at some level break down people's motivations in response to different stimuli, including with this, when you apply this framework. So actually, I really love this framework to deal with that problem.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, just to add to that, I mean, so I'm a pediatrician and I've, I've dealt with the whole anti-vax for longer than I probably want to admit. But so part of like what we're working on is looking at social media disinformation and trying to redirect it to a better, but the problem is that you're not wrong. I mean, I've done a ton of work and I've worked in Medicaid. I've done a ton of work in social determinants of health and barriers to access to care. But unfortunately, somebody will get a hold of that fact and then will demonize it and say they're paying people for vaccines. Look, they're forcing it on people. So the thing that is actually needed to break down the barrier becomes demonized. So for instance, they're like similar to back when Obamacare was being passed, I think then, or maybe previous to that, we don't have enough kind of like talk about sort of end of life and death, and it's very, we're very like pro-life kind of like, we don't ever want to admit we're gonna die in this country,
We're
right?
pro-use is what we are.
We're pro-youth, so yeah, but I mean, we kind of are very scared of death and talking about it. So, and there's not, the average doctor needs 27 hours a day to get their job done, right? So one way to ensure something gets done is the incentive. So we can talk about the safe space, but is it really a safe space or is it the incentive behind things? And so those are two different kind of mindsets to think about. But when they were trying to ensure that the hospital, having been a chief medical officer, the hospital prioritized putting this into the workflow. It's not about the doctor, we're all employed now. It's the hospital administrator saying, this is important for you. When they paid for it, it was like, oh, the Democrats are trying to pay you to kill grandma, right? So anything you do that tries to remove a barrier in today's world of social media will be demonized. That's not to say don't do it, but just have that awareness that something with good intention, somebody else can misuse.
I'm not trying to start the debate, I just like how it fits into your framework.
No, I love it too, and I think that's just something and I think this like is balancing measures, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. So I mean, this is primarily what we do a lot of algorithmic research on, is how can we build systems that can sort of like extract wisdom from millions without really looking at your data. Or how can we like sort of scale up like a lot of the, like imagine could you get like 1 million chat GPTs to synchronously talk to each other? Now that's like a hard computational problem. And we spend a lot of time trying to like solve that problem, or we come up with ways to like ingest a lot of heterogeneous data into the system so that you can get like multiple views to the same problem when you're trying to make decisions. And like, yeah, we do a lot of like academic research. We work with a lot of like stakeholders, try to publish in like medical journals, clinical place scenarios, along with like a lot of core computer science venues so that like more technical people get involved in this research. And like, this is just to like computationally, we try to build like a new sort of like a paradigm to study these complex systems, because like the idea and the intuition has been around for a while, but the fundamental challenge has been like lack of resources. Like for example, like the public health department in Nigeria probably has like a few $100,000 in budget to track like a malaria outbreak in the country. And when you have that, a lot of the conventional computational tools are just not feasible because they'll cost you like millions of dollars just to run. So like we spend a lot of time just trying to make sure these tools are more computationally tractable, so that problems that would conventionally take hours to solve can be done in minutes on like your personal laptops, just to sort of commoditize the ability to simulate and orchestrate large ecosystems, and spend a lot of time like solving these technical problems. And to sort of take these ideas beyond the lab, we built this platform called Agent Torch, which is like, it has a core open source layer that you can use in a lot of your social impact ventures. If you're interested in it, they're on GitHub, can get started with it. And sort of we've used Agent Torch to like deploy like sort of LPMs around the world. We've reached like several millions of people. We like deploy, like our platforms are being used in a lot of scenarios. Like a good way to think about Agent Torch is like if you grew up playing SimCity, imagine SimCity but just like blown up to like calibrated to the census and blown up to like 100 million entities. And that's pretty much what like Agent Torch simulations look like. And through these kinds of simulations, we like try to like gamify it to solve like very domain specific problems. For instance, like in New Zealand, we help like bring like vaccines to their 5 million citizens across like COVID, now influenza, and now increasingly H5N1. Because New Zealand is a country which has like 5 million people and 50 million cattle. So probably like H5N1 is worse for them than COVID could have been. And in the fall, a lot of birds migrate north from the Antarctic into Australia and New Zealand. So there are two countries which are going to be like at greatest risk, because like 30% of New Zealand's GDP is driven by milk. So that's definitely going to be like a hard experience for them if they don't like do it strategically well. So in India, we're trying to help bring solar energy to millions of households by tracking like with vaccines. What we realized is like immunization was a harder problem to solve than building a vaccine, because behaviors and incentives sort of caused hesitation. So like in COVID, we had like more people die after the vaccine was built than before, which is like unfortunate. And if you're trying to like do a lot of climate action and accelerate, let's say, the adoption of like solar energy at a household level, probably the same problems will ripple out, because adoption of technology is going to be a harder problem. And how can you orchestrate these kind of systems? So in India, we're helping bring like solar energy to like millions of people by understanding the coupled dynamics of the energy grid along with like consumption behavior of people. Like in the US, we help like big companies track like large scale, like $1 billion dairy supply chains, and track like millions of products moving across the US enterprise. And like for like people who like use of some of our like more. Oh, sorry. Oh. How do I play?
Right. I think I'm next to manual.
Yeah. So like people who use our tools can like sort of use our platforms to like ask specific questions, see how like sort of some scenarios play out, but they can then also use it to like ask follow-up questions so that you have grounded contextual responses. And because these are like complex webs of interconnection, the goal is to be able to like decouple impact across different levels of the system to see like, if I'm trying to like implement lockdown policies during the pandemic, should I focus on like closing pubs versus theaters versus schools versus colleges? And if you're like more strategic about it, we can like make sure that we achieve like more optimal responses for the community. Probably children would have to like sit at homes as much, and like adults can, like old people can receive better care. And this is like a general theme of problem we want to solve. Like if I sort of dive deeper, just to give more context, like just imagine like the entire problem. And the next phase that we'll have to spend a lot of time thinking about is like, how do you stop spread of disease between humans? So that's like the fundamental problem we care about. And now this is a hard problem, because like if you think of the COVID-19 pandemic, it cost almost $1 trillion. I think I should like move this up. Yeah. So the COVID-19 pandemic cost $1 trillion. And if you just like look at it, like we spent around $200 billion on interventions and $800 billion trying to incentivize people to take those interventions. It seems like behavior seems to be like more of a dominant variable than the clinical dynamics.
This is just the US numbers.
This is just the US numbers. And this is independent of all the CARES Acts and all the other like business or like mortgage forbearance or other incentives that US government provided. I mean, there's a lot of like good economic, macroeconomic analyses on like how just US COVID stimulus created like some kind of like a mini inflation in itself, because purchasing power, because like consumption patterns of people did not change too much and they got too much free money in their hands. And so definitely like a hard problem, both like at an economic and societal level. And in some sense, this is a tough problem to solve, because when you're trying to make decisions to orchestrate a society, trying to figure out incentives of an individual versus the incentives of a collective may not always reconcile, may not always align, and reconciling them is a hard problem. Let me ask you like a simple question. Okay, yeah. So you spent like $80 billion trying to give people tests, but like something we haven't been able to agree on for a very long time is like, what kind of a test do you want? So if I give you two choices, there's like a blue pill, which has a 10% false positive rate, gives you a result in 3 days. And there's like a 40% false positive rate and gives you a result in 1 day. Like, which test do you want and which one should you get?
Oh,
Like so that the constraint is you're only allowed to pick one. You cannot like pick n and like, because like we have a fundamental like resource constraint, and the rule is like if you test positive, you have to quarantine for 21 days, and they'll lock you in. Like, which one do you pick?
And this is like for an infection, we're talking about the same thing that we're talking about for the same disease.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like the COVID-19 pandemic, and like a simple preference, like it's COVID-19 is a disease. Like it spreads from human to human, so it's like transmissible, it's infectious, and you have to take a test to know are you infected or not. And if you test positive, you have to just sit at home for 21 days. And like the first test, there's like a 10% chance it'll give you like a false positive.
I mean, I think if there's a high mortality, you want if there's a high mortality, you would want the red one. If there's a high infectivity and mortality.
I'm saying just you as an individual,
Oh.
like which one would you want to pick?
Well, I like to think I'm also a responsible person, so I'd rather take the red one. But not you.
I would say blue too, especially if you're gonna tell me that I'm gonna go sit in quarantine for 21 days. So I would take the one that is most likely to be accurate and quarantine myself for 3 days before having to.
yeah, I agree with that. I'll take the blue pill.
I mean, I would take the blue one as well. Sorry. You thought.
I was about to say, if you could add context where you take my swab and put it in the same tube for a test with 10 others and give me the red one, then I will take this. If the population prevalence is very small, not a lot of people have the disease. The moment it goes up, I'm switching.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like that's how we always bulk test.
Yeah.
So even if we give you the blue pill, that's like, even if we give you the blue pill, like that's how like PCR tests were sort of bulk tested, even like here in South. So that's, yeah, I mean, I would always take the blue pill, like that would make sense. And to be fair, like there's no right answer. Like if I'm in a city like New York City, where like interaction complexity is really high, then probably the red can be a good collective outcome, because like people move around, infect each other, and like transmissibility is really high around the time you decide to take a test. But if I'm living in like rural Idaho, where like everybody lives 20 miles apart, then probably the blue one is not a bad idea. Because like a downside of the red one is not just the clinical impact, but it also like feeds in a lot of like hesitancy against like unreliable outcomes, which sort of which causes us to go back and spend like $800 billion on just stimulus checks so that people can take a vaccine, and like other downstream impacts. There's usually not a right answer, and like these are like hard problems to solve. And the whole idea is like, imagine you were in New York City with like just bad graphics. But like, I mean, this is just trying to say like, imagine like in the context of New York City with like millions of people, hundreds of thousands of small businesses, and like millions of households. How would we like sort of put these scenarios in practice if you were using like large population models? So imagine like you could like build some kind of like a gamified simulation where you can track how disease transmits amongst people and how do infected people like evolve in their state. And you can run it out over many, many days and track for different configurations of like properties of the disease, compliance patterns of people, mortality rates of the virus. How does like the outcome play out? And you can probably want to run this in a simulation again and again and again to evaluate many different configurations to see how things play out. And if you were to do that with LPMs, what you could do is you could simulate disease spread across 8 million agents in an ecosystem, roughly representing New York City at an individual level. you'd want to like somehow calibrate these models to like disease and intervention data to see like what is wastewater signal, compliance behavior telling me about the dynamics of the disease, so that you can then optimize policies, but with strong constraints of privacy. Or to ask questions like, if I've got $1 million to spend, who should I vaccinate? If I'm trying to pick a test, should I prioritize the speed of the test, like speed of the test result or like accuracy of the test? And if you use Agent Torch, like our platform, you can like, you get like simple Python code to like scale these simulations to millions. You can like just get started in few lines of code, build like high resolution visualizations. If you want to like implement some of these things in practice, you can like, yeah, like a simulation is very composable. You can like represent extremely diverse behaviors. You could use like LLMs to capture how an individual might respond, along with like some kind of like differential equations to capture how birds are migrating across the country or how the virus is evolving. And you can implement extremely stochastic behavior, saying like, have like a very realistic representation of how do you bring vaccines to people. If you take a test, you may or may not get a result for 4 days. Or if I ask you to take a vaccine, you may or may not come for the first dose. Or if you take the first dose, you may or may not come back for the second dose. Like usually these scenarios are very stochastic, a lot of if-else conditions, and like our platform allows you to represent those operations in a very seamless manner. And then you can come up with like better ways to like calibrate these models to data. And this is where it becomes really useful in practice, because we spent some time during the pandemic helping the UK NHS trying to like sort of design lockdown policies. And a lot of the conventional models they use relied on like older strategies to calibrate a model, but like calibration would roughly take like 100,000 hours on a CPU, and which is like roughly like several weeks. So during a rapidly evolving crisis like a pandemic, that's a hard problem, because you have to like roll out a policy in 30 days. But like simulations are just scenario analysis, which is the first step of the process. If that takes a month, then it's unlikely that I'll be able to like get to a decision in time. So after they started using our models, they could do it for like, they could iterate much more rapidly, like in meetings, and come up with like more directed policy designs, and saves you like millions of dollars, which is like relevant in the context of pandemic. And other things you can do is like we've got like these interfaces where you can like put on these like natural language heads on top of like the simulation environments you build. And one of the more interesting things we have is that imagine you're trying to like run out these disease policies. So fundamentally, if I'm trying to simulate the outcome of a disease, the bottleneck that matters is like how are people moving around influencing each other. If you don't have a good sense of interaction patterns, very quickly your decisions will drift away from reality. So they won't be like calibrated to what's really going on in the world. You don't have a good sense of what's happening. So our simulations, like they're not just simulations, you can actually shift them to the real world. For example, like in the context of a disease simulation, you can actually deploy them over contact tracing protocols. And like this is what like Ramesh, like my advisor, sort of pioneered during the pandemic, where we built like contact tracing apps for several US states and territories. It became like the world's largest open source project for COVID-19. Reached like over 10 million people in terms of direct and indirect app usage, like just this coverage of exposure notifications across the world. And what you can now also do is you have these contact tracing apps, which are fully private. They are sensing information, but they get the current state of the world. Like if 10% of the population installs contact tracing apps, I know a little bit about them, which was good because I know something about a part of the population, but it wasn't very actionable because I don't know too much about the rest 90% today, and I don't even know anything about this 10% tomorrow, because like contact tracing apps are not allowed to save any data because of like ethics, privacy, and surveillance constraints, because they literally track you as you move around. So I wouldn't want that information to be stored. But like if you use our platforms with population models, you can actually close this gap between simulation and reality, which allows us to actually make contact tracing apps actionable, turning them into like contact intelligence platforms, where you can essentially like track the spread of a disease in a city without looking at the demographic status, disease, or geolocation of any person. Or you can like do very synchronized computation between these large simulations sitting in like a command center and like these contact tracing apps running on mobile devices of millions of people around the world. Can fully synchronize them with like guaranteed privacy and like fast computation. And this is primarily what Agent Torch is meant to enable.
I was gonna ask, is Agent Torch exclusively for public health issues?
No,
Or what are some other examples?
So I mean, so we do like a lot of, so like exactly, so like we support like a lot of different, this is just one example.
Mhm.
So we do a lot of energy work, we do a lot of supply chain work, like for one of the bigger like supply chain companies in the world, we manage over like, I would say like roughly like 10 billion products across the US every year, which like runs on top of our platforms. It's used for a lot of like financial applications. For example, like what also happened like is like if people like if let's say some housing crises or some hurricane crisis happens, so like you have to give people for like insurance products. So can you design like more green insurance products to make sure that like I mean if you go to like beachfront properties in like Nantucket, they'll probably not be like as valuable as they were 10 years ago because everything's going bad. So like there's a lot of focus on like trying to like reinsure products to be like green products. How do sort of banks hit like green, like how to sort of incentivize sustainable development. So we have a lot of products around like supply chains, real estate. We do a lot of like energy grid management. In India next year, we're helping manage something called the Kumbh Mela. It's basically like the Hindus version for the Hajj. It's like a 30-day event with like 30 million people. So you want to do like crowd control. Like most of the movies we would see like as a child growing up were in India were like two brothers who got lost at Kumbh and meet after 30 years. That was like a very standard template for like movies in India. So like we're trying to build like the first AI first Kumbh Mela where you can like use these platforms to like orchestrate mobility, ensure like crowd control, delivery of clinical services, supply chains, like a lot of applications in different verticals.
Can you talk a little bit on that data front, like where you guys get data? Is there a way to look at the list of data set you have and sources and all that
Oh,
stuff?
so we don't, so that's it. This is more like a computational platform.
Okay.
So we have some core data loaders that we support. For example, we've got data loaders to the census.
Yeah.
So we support like the US census, the New Zealand census, the UK census, which
Yeah.
is mostly public data.
Okay.
But for a lot of the deployment applications, data is like
Right, so bring your own
enterprise.
data.
It's more
Yeah.
like bring your own data.
Okay, so on that note though, who's paying for the compute?
Usually the people we work with are paying. Like the governments pay or like, it depends, but like mostly like it's the other team paying. Because like, I mean, it's like a platform. It's like if you're trying to run like PyTorch code on your device.
Yeah, okay,
Like-
I got it. So
like it's
when
your
your own
compute.
data, like have to figure out the compute, you guys have the kind of the the middle.
The infrastructure to make sure your
model.
computation will work.
Yeah.
And like we do provide some data loaders, like we've got like a very active open source community around the world, like trying to like solve a lot of problems in the context of like different countries, different demographics, different society. So we have like very specific data loaders, but like nothing very generic. Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah. Lift max.
So did you say this was a social enterprise or is this purely a research project?
Yeah, I mean, it's largely, I mean, I'm still doing a PhD here.
Yeah.
It's largely a research project, but like, I mean, our general focus has been that don't just publish, but like demo and deploy.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
and that's usually the focus, like a lot of like the research ideas for me that come from like real world scenarios when like we observe something as it's being deployed and say, oh, this was a constraint that needs to be solved.
So what is the ultimate outcome for you? What would make you feel like you've delivered something that's gonna make you feel really great about this project?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, like actually, that's a very interesting. So like, there's one slide that I've been actually tracking for years.
Yeah.
So for me, like, oh, it's back in the beginning. So that's like the only slide, to be honest, I care about, which is this. So I mean, I've been tracking this slide for like 5 years. Like, ideally, I would like blow up completely by the time I'm like done with this. Hopefully, like I don't know, but like this is pretty much the only slide I care about. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, like I've got like this version of the slide made for like different numbers. Hopefully, like we'll hit a time where like there's more purple or like it's more colorful, where we can index by like how we impacted lives of people along different dimensions. Right now, like the scale is not big enough for me to have like a color-coded legend. So I've got like those versions as well. So this is pretty much the only slide I care about.
Fascinating.
It's amazing. First of all, okay, huge thanks. I feel like for me, at least, a huge takeaway from hearing, honestly, both of you speak is the interconnectedness of all of the stakeholders, thinking about incentives. How do you think about behavior and how people might act? And you have all the data in the world, you can't necessarily tell, you know, see what people might do unless you use something like this. So part of the reason we wanted to bring Ayush in is recognizing that you being at MIT, if you're working on a problem like this, there are so many resources available to you. As you said, your GitHub, I think, is.
Yeah, it's public. You just go to GitHub/agent.torch.
Yeah, so like definitely if this is relevant, I know at least some of you I've talked to who are online might find this interesting. But I am curious just I know we're kind of at the end of time, but really, really quickly in like 1 or 2 sentences, what are some takeaways that you are feeling or as you're sitting right now thinking about your own projects and from both of our conversations? What's something that you are going to take away from today's conversation? How you're going to think about AI and social impact? All of the considerations there. So who wants to kick us off?
So I'm here partially because I want to create collaboration with the Babson Institute of Social Innovation and this group.
Fantastic.
And so for me, it's just reinforcing how much I would love your involvement.
Okay.
That-
To hear.
Babson's a great institution, but they don't have the same technical chops, you know, within orders of magnitude. And I think you guys would bring an amazing amount of insights.
Thank you. We appreciate hearing
My,
that.
my suitcase is right here. I'm headed to Babson.
Oh, right.
Oh.
Or the global.
Yeah, the GCEC.
Yeah, GCEC.
Yeah,
That's
they're
like-
having it at the Marriott, right? So when you head to the Marriott, I was there earlier. That's right.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, other like 1 sentence takeaway. What are you kind of leaving with today?
I guess I'll probably just carry home with me the question about what is AI, what is ethics. I guess I'm trying to figure that out. But I was just looking into this, the concept of cultural universals, or like Howard Gardner that in Harvard talks about multiple intelligence. To me, AI or like AI, artificial intelligence, it could be another intelligence from Howard Gardner's perspective from universal concept. It is just an extension of another, like a unique thing that makes human human. You know? So I'm trying to see this ethics, if become part of AI, then it can be an extension of human being. That's my take.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, sometimes like the most obvious things like is there like, you know, like we need to ask those questions, even though we talk about it all the time and think we have all the answers.
Oh, we have a hand raised on.
Keisha.
Go
Go
for
ahead,
it,
Keisha.
Keisha. Yeah.
My takeaway is that I think we've barely begun to scratch the surface on AI. And I'm learning that it's more than generative AI and LLMs. Just looking at this and just the application of technology as a whole, this was really good to see. This has really fired up my mind.
Love that. Thank you, Keisha. Yeah, you're one in particular. I was like thinking would appreciate this. Anyone else? Good takeaways from the day.
It's so inspiring to see someone thinking about such an incredibly important problem, right? The Bob Langer, right? Don't focus on anything other than massive problems. And to walk in, I missed the first presentation, unfortunately, but very inspiring to see that Ayush and the team are thinking about something of this incredible importance. Yeah, well, please.
I have one lingering question, Ayush, is why is your lab called the camera culture?
Actually, I have a couple of slides for that. Yeah, so we've got camera culture because like for 15 years, the lab spent a lot of time like building cameras. Where like the primary goal was still in some way sense to like see the invisible. And like we built cameras that can like look around corners, see through fog. And to build those things, like the fundamental problem we solved is like, can we go one level deeper? And what if we simulate like 50 million photons as they move through the world, since like from source to destination, to see like how those photons move around the world. And if we can track the mobility patterns of millions of photons, we can figure out like how do they sort of move around the corner, how do they sort of go through like a lot of like foggy environments. And we sort of use a lot of those ideas to like build these large scale photonic simulations to like go sort of one level up now in the context of like society, where can we like now orchestrate instead of photons, can we like simulate millions of interacting people to sort of make decisions at like a billion scale. But we're pretty much doing the same thing before, and like a lot of our tools transfer. Because it's like if you watch like a movie like Frozen, and you see like that princess go up and like that shadow cast come down, that happens because like to like render a scene like that, we're simulating like millions of photons in that scene. Because like we have some sense of physics of like how light moves. So now we try to like uncover like the physics of like how individual behaviors might like affect collective outcomes. It's the same problem, but at a different scale.
It's a very interesting, I'd like to shadow you for a day and just see how you view the world. Yeah, definitely wanna, oh, yeah, go
Yeah,
for it.
I mean, I think just from putting sort of like this, both the talks in context of just like what's happening, so I don't know if people saw RFK Jr., is gonna be their next HSS secretary.
We saw.
So, so I think the example, even though I answered differently than most people about sort of would you pick the red or the blue? Because I think to me, I think about all the issues that I think was also brought up about like how infectious is it, how fatal is it, what is the spread? But thinking about that with information, right? So like a lot of people can get immediate information off of like Twitter or Facebook, but the more accurate answer might take longer. But if you can get free, fast information, how do you, that's the space we're building, really kind of thinking about how do you redirect away from social media misinformation in a way that is accurate and responsible, and but still satisfactory.
And I think I'll just maybe bring it back to, for those of you who are working in this space and have maybe some of you who even participated in our workshop on systems change, really thinking about your project, what you're doing and how it connects to this broader system. And especially when you're able to use tools like this and have a better understanding of that coherence within the system and which aspects maybe are not working or what kind of incentives might get someone to make one choice over another, and then what role you can play in your projects to influence that. So I want to be mindful of time and say thank you everyone for joining us. We'll share this recording, and obviously we are here to support as you're wrapping up your applications. Please find time to schedule with us, and thank you again to our wonderful speakers.